working. He finally got the logs on his screen, and I was able to start skimming through what he had there. It kind of started to dawn on me, maybe this is real. Maybe he's actually turned in WikiLeaks' most important whistleblower.
Adrian Lamo says he gave the story to Kevin Poulsen as insurance in case something happened to him.
I discussed with Kevin my interaction with government agents up to that point. I provided him with a copy of the logs for safekeeping, and at that point I went on to meet with government agents. I myself did not know if I was necessarily going to be coming back from that meeting, or if they would want to hold on to me for some unknown reason based on the information that I already had in my possession.
It was on the drive back from Sacramento where I found myself wondering if I was going to be stopped on the Bay Bridge by the feds saying, "Hey, you have something of ours." I mean, that I began to think that this was actually a big story.
In the weeks following Private Bradley Manning's arrest, an even bigger story was building. Julian Assange by now was a wanted man, as he circled the globe with the treasure trove of documents he'd allegedly received from Private Manning. In conditions of great secrecy, Assange did a deal with two of the world's major newspapers, the New York Times and The Guardian.
There was a lot of cloak and dagger about it because he was, I think, probably the most hunted man on earth at that point because of what he had. And it sounded extraordinary. And when he first came back with his sort of password and we opened up the website, and this was just the first tranche, so this was just the first set of war logs. You could immediately see that this was, of tremendous significance and was going to make an awful lot of people and governments really unhappy.
What Assange had given The Guardian was the Afghan War Diary, a vast compilation of army reports from the war stretching back to 2004. More revelations would follow.
This disclosure is about the truth.
In October 2010, the Iraq war logs were published, detailing allegations of torture by the Iraqi Federal Police and complicity in that torture by the US Armed Forces in Iraq.
And this is a list of reports with sort of keywords in context.
The logs revealed the military's own inside story of the wars, and for the journalists charged with sifting through the documents, it was a God-given gift.
The greatest story, to my mind, of this era for journalists is the way, at least in the West, at least for the U.S., is the way September 11th has transformed American foreign policy. Not only in the ways that are very noticeable, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in other ways too. And suddenly, as journalists who've had to rely on third-hand, fourth-hand, late-night interviews with people who knew pieces of this, we had the whole, so we were elated. Of course we were.
The publication of the Afghan and Iraqi war logs made Julian Assange a global celebrity. But while Assange was fated, Private Bradley Manning languished in a military cell. The soldier on his arrest had been charged with leaking more than 50 diplomatic cables to a person outside the army. But the authorities, who had Adrian Lamo's version of the chat logs, believed he'd passed on 260,000 cables.
There's been this US intelligence analyst, Bradley Manning, arrested, and it's alleged that he confessed in a chat room to have leaked this video to you, along with 280,000 classified US embassy cables. I mean, did he?
Well, we have denied receiving those cables. He has been charged about 5 days ago with obtaining 150,000 cables and releasing 50.
I mean, if you did receive thousands of US embassy diplomatic cables...
We would have released them. Yeah.
You would?
Yeah.
So let's talk a little more...
In fact, the cables were already in Assange's possession. and 4 months later they were published in The Guardian and New York Times. Just how seriously the US administration viewed this massive leak became clear when Dean Baquet and his colleagues approached the White House to discuss redacting the cables before they were published to ensure no lives were endangered.
We walked in with some cables just to show them what we had. And we walked in expecting, maybe 2 or 3 people from the government. And it was a packed conference room of people from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the State Department, the White House. And it was a tense discussion. It was very tense. Initially, it was they were making the argument that these are not things that should be made public. There were people in the room who said this would have a devastating impact on foreign policy. And we made the argument back for why we felt obliged to publish.
Within WikiLeaks itself, there was also fierce debate about whether it was in Bradley Manning's best interests to publish the cables.
If the cables had not been published, there would have been no proof that anyone had given the material to a different entity. So from my perspective, whatever should have happened with these cables, for the sake of Bradley Manning, would have been to just keep them back as long as possible until you find out what is happening with him before you publish them.
We were concerned as to how that would possibly play into his case. We saw that his charges only included some 50 cables, so we're not sure whether that is related to the material that we've released, but we could see that extra accusations would probably be made against him, given that he was the only name being floated around by the US military.
After the cables were published, Private Manning was charged with 22 offences, including the charge of aiding the enemy, a capital offence. Military prosecutors say they will not seek the death penalty, but if convicted, the private faces life imprisonment.
Modus operandi is to...
Julian Assange insists the technology used by WikiLeaks prevents it knowing the identity of its sources.
So, I had never heard the name Bradley Manning before I saw media reports about this.
If Adrian Lamo's chat logs are genuine, Bradley Manning believed his contact at WikiLeaks was Assange. But according to Daniel Domscheit-Berg, it's quite plausible that Julian Assange didn't know the soldier's identity.
They could have talked without exchanging their names, or Bradley Manning wouldn't have necessarily told Julian his name.
Hillary Clinton and several thousand diplomats around the world are going to have a heart attack when they wake up one morning and find an entire repository of classified foreign policy is available in searchable format to the public.
The United States strongly condemns the illegal disclosure of classified information. It puts people's lives in danger, threatens our national security, and undermines our efforts to work with other countries to solve shared problems.
What has angered the United States government more than anything is the wholesale leaking of the State Department's diplomatic cables. Opinions differ as to how much damage this has done.
The government overall is horrified. This is the sort of the worst crisis in release of leaks of government documents, I think, in history. And for the State Department, it's really almost apocalyptic to have 250,000 cables lost. It affects our relations with every country in the world and puts sources of information, not only government sources, but human rights activists and dissidents and others at great risk.
I think the interesting thing is that nobody at the end of it can really point to any danger. Everyone was saying the sky was going to fall in, that people would be killed, that states would never be able to speak, but none of that happened. And now, in fact, the State Department is tacitly admitting that actually they can't point to any harm.
Ironically, this gigantic leak of diplomatic cables was only made possible by the US government's decision post 9/11 to bring in a policy of greater information sharing in the wake of the intelligence failures that allowed al-Qaeda's attacks to occur.
Major disasters occurring in New York City this morning.
The new strategy meant that a lowly private stationed in Iraq was able to access enormous databases of secret and classified material. That policy was called net-centric diplomacy.
Net-centric diplomacy put the bulk of U.S. State Department cables on the military's private internet, its classified network called CIPRANet, where it could be accessed by hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. and at foreign bases and posts. And that is what Manning apparently took advantage of.
Given this unparalleled access, Private Manning is believed to have breached security on the CIPRANet computer with almost farcical ease. Lady Gaga played a starring role, according to the chat logs, as Manning downloaded 250,000 diplomatic cables.
I would come in with music on a CDRW, labeled with something like Lady Gaga, erase the music, then write a compressed split file. No one suspected a thing. Listened and lip-synced to Lady Gaga's telephone while exfiltrating possibly the largest data spillage in American history.